Owen Murphy, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Regling. Just picking up from my colleagues' questions on the policy side of things, one of your policy lessons is that the design of fiscal policy, or fiscal policy shouldn't be designed and tax bases shouldn't be eroded for distortive goals. What do you mean when you say that, by distortive goals?
Well, in this context, distortion really means in favor of real estate and property.
Real estate.
Because we see these tax exemptions, we see in, the possibility at the time to deduct interest rates on mortgages. So all these things that promoted from the fiscal side, from the tax side, moving in this wrong direction and fueling the bubble, that led to the distortions.
And you said that there was no clear policy evidence for why these changes were made in the tax structure at the time. Is that?
Yeah, so that's why we said it was ad hoc.
And when you appeared in the Finance Committee in 2010, you said that you, as part of your report, didn't interview the Prime Minister at the time, the Taoiseach.
That's correct, yeah.
Why was that?
Well, I promise not to mention any names, but I think it's known we interviewed several finance ministers. I don't know. I think we didn't try to interview the Prime Minister. We talked to so many people that we thought we had a pretty good impression of what we needed to know for the report.
But you were aware that he was a Minister for Finance during the period?
Sorry?
You were aware that he was previously the Minister for Finance during the period of your report?
Yeah, of course, yeah. And actually, I met him in that capacity when I worked for the Commission, yeah,
okay,
in the ECOFIN Council.
But you decided not to interview him when you were doing this report?
Yeah.
Okay. To move on to the regulation model, because I don't know if this is a contradiction or not in your report, but you talk about the structure being an experiment, a regulatory model at the time, and about it coming from a compromise. And when your colleague, Mr. Watson, was in front of the Finance Committee, he said that in relation to not having the Prudential Director on the board, everyone knew it was wrong, so much so that they wrote to the Department of Finance and said, we can't possibly do that, we are going to put him on the board anyway. But then you conclude that the design of our regulatory system wasn't the issue. Can you expand on what was happening in terms of the design in the first instance and then why the design wasn't an issue, given what happened?
Yeah. Indeed, many countries have experimented with trying to find the correct design for supervision. Some countries from the beginning left it with central banks, others took it out, like in the UK, and now they put it back with the Bank of England. So these things are going back and forth, and Max Watson and my conclusion, not only for Ireland but globally, is that it plays less of a role. We are not saying it's unimportant, but it's less of a role what really the structure is, the institutional setup. It's more important that the culture is the right one. If the people plays a role in an assertive, hands-on way, that is more important than the institutional setup. Because if the institutional setup is perfect, if one can find a perfect setup, but then it's hands-off, non-intrusive, too polite, and with the belief that markets will find a way themselves, then the perfect institutional setup doesn't really help. That's why we put this conclusion, which is a global conclusion, not only for Ireland.
Okay, so just to be clear on that, I mean, although there were clearly problems in putting together this regulatory infrastructure, no matter what design we might have ended up with or why we ended up with it, ultimately, given the way it was implemented, it wasn't going to work in the way it should have.
If the culture is not the right one, if the people in charge, whatever the institutional setup, are not playing their role the way it should happen, then the best institution doesn't help. But I don't want to say that the institution doesn't matter at all. It's important to get it right and have the lines of communication correct, and the right people have to be in the right meetings. All of that is important. We only want to say it's even more important that the people in charge really play their role well.
Thank you. You spoke briefly earlier about the view in Europe prior to our crisis, our bank guarantee, on letting a bank fail. Was there a view on bank nationalisation or a policy?
I don't think there was a policy. When the crisis hit, all this came unexpectedly. That's why we didn't have the institutions in place, like my institution. There were not policies in place that today one would wish with hindsight that they had been in place. So there were then approaches taken and decisions taken without having a general policy developed first.
Okay. And just my final question, if I may. I mean, you mentioned just a moment ago about culture, and you've talked about cultural attitudes in this country. When Mr. Wright, who was in the Department of Finance in Canada, was before us, and in his report he talked about Ireland failing this test of prudent fiscal management. Do you see any cultural problems or cultural aspects in this country that make it difficult for us to manage Euro membership, policy formation, everything that goes with it?
No, I think in this country you have learned. In other countries where we saw problems during the crisis, people have learned. In the euro area as a whole, we have learned. The institutions also have learned, like the Commission. What you imply that even today Ireland is not fit for the monetary union, that I would not support at all.
Thank you.